What if everything you thought you knew about the birth of Archie and Lilibet was a carefully constructed illusion? An illusion protected so fiercely that even Prince Harry himself wasn't meant to uncover the truth. What if the fairy tale image of motherhood, glowing happiness, and picture-perfect royal milestones was nothing more than the most fragile mask Meghan Markle ever wore? And what if that mask finally cracked? Not because of a scandal, not because of a media leak, but because of a diary she never intended anyone, especially Harry, to read? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Think about that for a moment. A diary, not a leaked email, not a text message, not a forgotten PR draft. A personal handwritten diary filled with guilt, fear, secrecy, and a truth too explosive to fit inside the palace walls. A diary that reveals a version of events the public never imagined. A version so contradictory, so emotionally raw, that it calls into question every smiling photo, every official announcement, every timeline the world accepted without hesitation. Let me ask you directly. If a mother documents her own fear about a pregnancy that the world believes she carried, what does that mean? What does that tell you? What does it imply about everything we were shown? Because according to the fictional diary at the center of this story, nothing, absolutely nothing, about the births of Archie and Lilibet was straightforward. Not the timing, not the circumstances, not even the roles of the people involved. And the most shocking part? Harry didn't know. Imagine discovering that your entire understanding of how your children came into the world was built on a foundation of omissions, half-truths, and emotional panic scribbled into journal entries written late at night. Imagine reading something that makes your heart stop, your hands shake, and your trust collapse in a single moment. That's the emotional punch described in the pages of this diary, the same pages that form the backbone of this story. But before we go deeper, picture the scene. A book, a simple, leather-bound journal, cream pages, a faint scent of ink and perfume. Nothing about it screams scandal, but everything inside it does. It wasn't found in a vault or an office or a suitcase. It wasn't part of a PR drop or a media bait. It was tucked somewhere far more personal, almost sentimental. Somewhere that suggested Meghan needed it close enough to reach, but hidden enough never to be discovered. The handwriting is emotional, firm in some lines, shaky in others. Words underline themselves as if her own fear etched them deeper. Some entries end abruptly, as if she couldn't finish the thought. Others ramble, pouring out anxieties she didn't dare speak aloud. And as you turn the pages, you start to notice something unsettling. The diary isn't about the children. It's about the secret surrounding them. That's when you realize the stakes of this story aren't just emotional. They're existential. They redefine identity, lineage, trust, and image. They redefine a marriage. They redefine what the world was told. And they begin with one sentence on the very first page, written in rushed handwriting that looks like it came from someone who was terrified of her own thoughts. I must promise myself to keep this hidden. Why would a woman who becomes a mother write something like that? Why would someone who appears confident, poised, and in control admit to needing secrecy from the very first line? This is where the contradictions begin to pile up. Publicly, Meghan radiated excitement about becoming a mother. Publicly, she was calm, composed, glowing, and ready. Public statements emphasized joy, anticipation, family unity. But the diary suggests something entirely different, something colder, heavier, and infinitely more complex. Fear, anxiety, guilt, choices she wasn't ready to share, and a plan that was apparently already in motion long before the public ever wondered. But the most chilling part? The diary doesn't start with love. It doesn't start with anticipation. It doesn't even start with the children. It starts with a decision. A decision Meghan implies she made alone. A decision she claims she couldn't bring herself to explain. A decision she believed would protect everything, yet at the same time threaten everything if discovered. She never names the decision in the first entry. She dances around it, hinting, circling, retreating, returning with trembling sentences. You can feel the emotional weight pressing on her. You can feel the secrecy tightening around her like a rope. You can feel her wanting to confess, but also wanting to run from the very truth she's writing. And the moment she mentions Harry, just a brief, fleeting reference, you sense the emotional split. Publicly, she appeared to share everything with him. Privately, according to this diary, she had already begun to hide something monumental, something life-changing, something irreversible, something connected directly to how Archie and Lilibet came into the world. The shock builds slowly, layer by layer, contradiction by contradiction, until one detail appears near the bottom of the page, almost scribbled into the margin as if she added it in a moment of panic. A decision we made today will change everything. We. Who is we? She doesn't say Harry. She doesn't say family. She doesn't say doctors, advisors, consultants, or anyone familiar. She simply writes we. And that single word creates a silence heavier than any admission she could have made directly. Who was she talking about? Who was helping her make this decision? Why wasn't Harry mentioned anywhere near that line? And most importantly, what decision could rewrite the entire story of the children's births? She ends the page abruptly. No signature, no closing sentence, just a line of pressure marks in the paper, as if she pressed the pen too hard and then put it down with shaking hands. But before the ink even dries, the next diary page jumps straight into something else, something even more suspicious. She references a meeting, a secret meeting, a meeting she claims must never appear on any calendar, a meeting that she says is only the beginning, a meeting that she calls the conversation that will define the next chapter of my life. And right as she writes, I'm scared he will find out, the diary cuts off. Not the chapter, not the story, just the entry. As if she couldn't finish the thought, as if she didn't want to, as if writing it felt too dangerous. This is where everything changes, because the next entry introduces the first real twist in this story. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Because the very next page of the diary doesn't ease the reader in. It doesn't recap, it doesn't soften the tone, and it certainly doesn't pretend everything is fine. Instead, it starts with one brutal, chilling line that feels like an emotional slap across the face. Today I agreed to something I can never undo, even if I beg for a second chance. That sentence alone feels like a confession whispered into the dark, the kind that makes your stomach tighten because you know the writer is admitting to crossing a line she never intended to return from. It immediately confronts you with panic, guilt, and determination all tangled together. And it forces you to ask the question, what decision could be so life-altering that even Meghan herself feared she would one day beg to reverse it? As you read on, the air around the diary feels heavier, almost suffocating. Meghan describes walking into a room where everyone already knew what they wanted except me. A sentence that shakes the illusion of control she always projected publicly. The contradiction is impossible to ignore. The world saw a confident woman who made bold choices, who spoke her truth, who charted her own path. But the woman writing these lines? She is unsure, overwhelmed, pulled in multiple directions by pressure she refuses to name. She writes about smiling during meetings when she wanted to scream. She writes about nodding at advice she didn't agree with. She writes about feeling like she was performing a version of herself instead of living her reality. And you have to wonder, was this secrecy protecting her reputation, or was it protecting her from her own doubts? The diary paints the meeting like a scene from a psychological thriller. Meghan describes a large table, dim lighting, 3 people whose faces she refuses to describe, and a conversation conducted in soft voices as if the walls themselves were listening. Every detail feels intentional. Every hesitation feels rehearsed. Every sentence drips with the suggestion that this was not a decision made lightly, impulsively, or carelessly. It was engineered, presented, packaged, and ultimately accepted under emotional duress. She writes, I kept telling myself it was the only option, even when my heart begged me to stop. And that single line strikes the core of everything that follows, because it implies the choice she made wasn't driven by excitement or ambition, but by fear. Then comes the most revealing moment of this entire entry. Meghan admits she didn't sleep for 2 nights after the meeting. She didn't talk. She didn't cry. She simply sat awake, staring into the dark, replaying every word spoken, every promise made, every expectation laid upon her shoulders. She writes about the silence in the room, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, the way she kept touching her stomach as if she expected it to give her an answer. This is emotional writing. Vulnerable writing. Writing that suggests a woman on the brink of collapsing under the weight of a secret she wasn't sure she could carry. And then she confesses something even more haunting. I didn't tell Harry. I couldn't. Not yet. Not when he was so hopeful. That sentence changes the entire emotional temperature of the diary. Suddenly, it's not just a story about a hidden choice. It's a story about a marriage built on an unspoken fracture. Meghan describes Harry smiling, excited, endlessly talking about the future, completely unaware that Meghan was hiding something monumental behind her rehearsed nods. She writes about feeling sick when he wrapped his arms around her. She describes guilt-souring moments that were supposed to be joyful. She even admits she avoided looking him in the eye because his honesty made my secret feel heavier. And you have to ask yourself, how does a relationship survive when one partner is carrying a truth they can't bear to reveal? Then the diary takes a sharper turn. The tone shifts from fear to practicality, from emotion to logistics. Meghan documents calls, plans, schedules, conversations that read like operations rather than personal milestones. She writes about deadlines, contracts, confidentiality clauses. She describes people whose names I must not record and arrangements I must follow exactly. The language becomes colder, almost detached, as if she's trying to distance herself emotionally from the very choice she made. And yet, buried inside this procedural language is a single moment of raw humanity. I want to be happy about this, but I feel like I'm lying to myself. That line is the emotional anchor of the entire entry. It exposes the inner war she's fighting, the one she can't admit out loud. Then comes the first concrete mention of someone else involved in the decision. A shadowy figure she refers to only as R. The way she writes about this person is strange. Respectful, grateful, but also uneasy. She describes R as calm, steady, reassuring, the kind of presence that makes chaos feel controllable. But she also describes R as someone whose role in the situation must never be linked to her publicly. R is the key to making this work, she writes. Without her, none of this is possible. This introduces a new mystery. Who is R? Why is her involvement so crucial? And why must her identity be protected at all costs? Then Meghan writes something that feels like an emotional admission wrapped in denial. I trust R, or at least I have to. That is not the statement of a woman fully convinced of her path. That is the statement of someone trying to convince herself. That emotional conflict seeps into every word. The contradictions are everywhere. She trusts but doubts, agrees but fears, commits but hesitates. It's the kind of psychological tension that creates the perfect storm for the dramatic twists still to come. And then, suddenly, Meghan shifts the diary into a memory that feels like a confession. She writes about imagining the future, public announcements, family celebrations, photos, statements, and feeling a knot in her throat because she knew those moments would be built on a truth the world could never hear. She writes about the fear of being found out. She admits she panicked whenever Harry asked simple questions because she was terrified he'd sense the difference in her tone. She describes waking up from nightmares where everything unraveled. And you begin to understand that the secrecy isn't just about the choice. It's about the emotional cost of maintaining the illusion surrounding it. Then she writes something that deepens the emotional crisis. I told myself I was protecting Harry. I told myself I was protecting the children. I told myself I was protecting our image. But I don't know if any of that is true. This line hits like a punch to the gut because it suggests Meghan wasn't convinced by her own justifications. It suggests she felt trapped long before the consequences became real. It suggests she was already questioning whether she had made a mistake. And then, everything changes again. Because Meghan writes about a moment she wasn't prepared for, a moment that shook her confidence and made the walls around her secret feel dangerously thin. She describes Harry walking into the room unexpectedly while she was reviewing documents she wasn't supposed to have. She describes scrambling to hide them, her heart racing, her hands trembling. She describes Harry's confused expression, the way he tilted his head, the way he asked, "Are you okay?" And she writes about how her guilty conscience interpreted that question like an accusation. This is where the emotional stakes skyrocket. Meghan writes, I thought he could see right through me. I thought he knew. I thought everything was about to collapse. But then she reveals the twist. Harry didn't suspect anything. Not yet. He was simply concerned because she looked stressed. That contradiction, Meghan panicking internally while Harry is innocently checking on her, creates a powerful dramatic contrast. It shows how isolated she felt. It shows how heavy the secret had become. It shows how far apart their emotional realities were drifting. And that leads into the next diary line, the one that sets up the next major twist in this story. I need to go through with the plan now. There's no turning back. That sentence feels like a lock clicking into place. It signals commitment, finality, inevitability. It signals that Meghan has chosen her path. No more hesitation. No more doubt. No more room for second thoughts. But she follows that finality with one chilling admission at the bottom of the page. If he ever discovers the truth, everything we built will fall apart. And that is where this section ends, because what Meghan wrote on the next page is even more shocking. What do you do when the very first sentence of a diary tells you that the writer was already hiding something before anything even happened? What do you do when the opening line isn't joy, excitement, or anticipation, but fear? Because that's exactly how the first full diary entry begins, with Meghan admitting she must keep this hidden. As though the truth itself was a living creature she was terrified would crawl into the light. And here's the unsettling part. This wasn't written in the middle of a crisis. It wasn't written after the children were born. It wasn't written during some dramatic family dispute. It was written long before any public announcement, before any timeline was shared, before any palace statement was drafted. This diary entry predates everything the world thinks it knows, and that alone changes the entire emotional atmosphere of this story. As you read deeper into the entry, the page feels like a psychological battlefield. Meghan writes in long, spiraling sentences that reveal she wasn't just anxious, she was fighting with herself. She describes waking up one morning with an overwhelming weight on her chest, something she blamed on stress or exhaustion. But the more you read, the more you sense it was guilt. She describes sitting at the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, repeating to herself, "I can handle this. I have to handle this," as if she were preparing for something she didn't want to face. And the contradiction hits hard. The world saw a glamorous, smiling royal figure entering a new chapter of motherhood, but her own diary paints a woman quietly unraveling under the pressure of a truth she couldn't share. Then she shifts into describing a moment that feels almost cinematic. A morning sunlight hitting the floor, Harry humming in another room. A calm domestic scene completely at odds with the storm inside her. It's this contrast that makes the entry so powerful. Public love, private fear, a warm home, a cold secret. She writes about hearing Harry laughing while making tea, and instead of feeling comforted, she felt her stomach twist. Why? She doesn't say it directly, but she leaves enough emotional breadcrumbs for you to understand. She felt guilty because she was planning something he didn't know about. Something huge. And then the diary takes a darker turn. Meghan describes sitting down at her desk with a pen, trying to write down her thoughts, but the words refused to form. She writes that she felt like she was diving into the deep end without knowing how to swim. That metaphor hits hard. She saw herself drowning in a situation she couldn't escape, yet she kept moving forward. She admits she was already too far into the plan to back out, but she never explains how far. That silence is louder than any confession could ever be. This is where the emotional tension becomes almost suffocating. Meghan writes about the pressure she felt from unnamed voices. Not individuals, but forces. Expectations. Public narratives. Royal obligations. A need to craft perfection. She describes how everyone wanted something from her. The press wanted headlines. The public wanted magic. The palace wanted stability. And Harry wanted joy. But what did Meghan want? Her diary never answers that clearly. Instead, it shows a woman torn between an image she had to protect and a reality she was terrified to face. She then writes something that stops you cold. I didn't know how to tell him. I didn't know how to tell myself. That sentence feels like an emotional earthquake. It means she wasn't just hiding the truth from Harry. She was struggling to admit it to herself. And that's when it becomes clear that the diary isn't just a confession. It's a mirror. A mirror reflecting a version of Meghan that contradicts the flawless public figure the world saw. Then the first major twist appears. She writes about receiving a call that morning from someone she doesn't describe, someone whose voice she says was steady but urgent. She doesn't mention a name, a title, or a role. She simply says they wanted an answer. An answer to what? She doesn't reveal it yet, but she writes that she paused for a long time, staring at the phone, feeling her hands shake. She describes the silence in the room, the ticking of a clock, the buzzing of her nerves. And then she writes, I said yes, even though I wasn't ready. That is the moment everything in the diary shifts. One word, one decision, one irreversible step. But she doesn't reveal what she agreed to, not yet. Instead, she immediately writes about the guilt that consumed her afterward. She describes pacing the room, running her fingers through her hair, breathing too fast, almost panicking. She writes that she felt like she had stepped onto a path she couldn't leave. A path that would require secrecy, discipline, and emotional sacrifices she wasn't prepared for. She describes the weight of the decision pressing on her chest like a stone. And then she writes something that reveals just how emotionally isolated she felt. There is no one I can tell, not even Harry, especially not Harry. She writes about hearing him approach the room and how she forced herself to smile when he walked in. She describes pretending to be fine, pretending to be calm, pretending to be excited about the future, all while hiding the truth inside her like a burning ember. She describes Harry placing his hand on her shoulder, asking if she was okay, and she writes that she wanted to break down and tell him everything. She wanted to confess. She wanted to unburden herself. But instead, she said she was tired. She said she'd slept poorly. She said she needed tea and quiet. Lies, wrapped in affection. And then she writes the first line that hints directly at the core of this story. Something about the timeline doesn't feel real anymore. Timeline. Which timeline? Whose timeline? Why wasn't it real? She doesn't clarify. She lets that unsettling statement sit alone on the page, a seed of doubt she refuses to explain. And then the entry grows even darker as she writes about the arrangement, the first time she mentions it. She doesn't describe it, but she writes that it's bigger than me and necessary for everything that comes next. She writes about a woman referred to only by two initials, RL, a figure she describes with both gratitude and fear. RL agreed, Meghan writes. And that means the plan is officially in motion. The plan, not hope, not preparation, not anticipation. A plan involving someone else. A plan Harry didn't know about. A plan that required secrecy, guilt, and emotional distance. And then the diary entry ends with a line she nearly scratches through, a line that shakes you even more because it sounds like she wrote it in a moment of unbearable honesty. If this goes wrong, I don't know who I'll be anymore. She doesn't explain what could go wrong. She doesn't explain who she fears becoming. She doesn't explain how this plan could reshape her entire identity. But the next diary entry, the next page, answers all of that. And what she writes there, no one could have predicted. No one could have predicted what she wrote next, because the second diary entry doesn't ease you in. It drops you straight into a moment of chaos. The handwriting is different. Not elegant, not controlled, not measured. It's rushed, slanted, uneven, the handwriting of someone whose mind is racing faster than her hand can keep up. The page begins with a single, jarring sentence. I met with R today, and nothing feels the same anymore. That line shocks you because it suggests the woman known only as R, the one mentioned so cryptically in the first entry, is not just a side figure or background character. She is central, essential, a catalyst in the unfolding secret. And the way Meghan describes this meeting makes one thing painfully clear. This wasn't a conversation between acquaintances. This was a meeting that determined the future. The entry spills into a heavy, suffocating description of the room where the meeting took place. Meghan describes the lighting as too bright for comfort, the chairs as too straight, too stiff, the air as too silent. She details the way R sat across from her, calm and unmoved, as though the conversation was about logistics rather than lives. And then Meghan admits something startling. She spoke as if the decision was already made. Like I had no other path left except the one she placed in front of me. That line exposes the tension between agency and pressure. Was this Meghan's decision? Or was she guided, influenced, cornered? The contradictions pile up. Meghan claims she agreed willingly, yet she also describes feeling directed into a choice she wasn't ready to confront. Then comes the emotional moment that transforms this entry into something almost confessional. Meghan writes that she felt like she was disappearing inside herself, like she was becoming a character instead of a person, someone playing a role expected of her. She describes nodding during the meeting, hearing words she barely processed, signing something she never fully read. My hand was moving, but my mind was frozen, she writes. That sentence hits hard because it speaks to fear disguised as compliance. It suggests she didn't grasp the full magnitude of what she was committing to. At least not in the moment. And then she reveals the first meaningful clue about the plan itself. R assured me everything would proceed smoothly. She said it has been done before. Many times. Done before? Many times. What exactly was being arranged? Something routine to R, but terrifying to Meghan. The diary doesn't explain it. Not yet, but the weight of those words creates a foreboding sense of something clinical, calculated, and deeply orchestrated. Then Meghan writes about time in a strange way. She says the hours after the meeting felt hollow, like her body was going through motions while her emotions lagged behind. She writes about returning home, about seeing Harry's face light up at her arrival, and feeling her heart sink into her stomach. He hugged me, she writes, and I wondered if he would still hold me like that if he knew what I'd agreed to. That single thought introduces the tragic arc that defines this entire chapter. It's not just Meghan hiding something. It's Meghan questioning whether her marriage would survive the truth. And then comes a confession that adds an even deeper emotional crack. Meghan writes that for the first time, she felt like she was living two lives, the public one beside Harry, and the hidden one with R. Harry talks about our future, she writes, but R and I are planning it. That line is devastating because it reveals a split in loyalty she never intended to create. She didn't mean to choose secrecy over honesty. She didn't mean to push Harry out of their own story. But that's what the diary shows. That's what the emotional truth reveals. And that's what makes the next sentences so heartbreaking. Meghan describes the moment she went upstairs to wash her face, and when she looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize herself. She writes about touching the edge of the sink, grounding herself, trying to breathe through the panic. She describes tears that wouldn't fall, a scream stuck in her throat, a weight pressing against her ribs. I don't know who I'm becoming, she writes. And then she admits something unbelievably vulnerable. I hope the children one day forgive me. Children. She mentions them not as infants growing inside her, but as an outcome of the plan. This subtle phrasing is intentional. The diary hints at something beyond a traditional pregnancy, something involving choices, arrangements, and decisions made with or that don't align with the public narrative. And then she shifts again. She writes about the timeline cracking. She describes the days ahead as blurred, the calendar entries feeling artificial, the deadlines feeling constructed. She writes that she had to rehearse certain explanations. She had to remember certain dates. She had to avoid slipping. The lies must fit together, she writes, or everything will unravel. That admission exposes the scale of secrecy she was preparing for. This wasn't a single decision. This was a strategy, a framework, a carefully plotted line of events she needed to execute flawlessly. But then the entry becomes even more damning, because she confesses that she didn't sleep that night. She stayed up listening to Harry breathe beside her, wondering how she could share a bed with someone while hiding a truth so large it could break him. Every time he reached for me, I froze, she writes, a line that almost aches with guilt. She writes about pulling away subtly, pretending she was too warm, pretending she needed space. Anything to avoid the fear that he could feel her heart pounding with secrets. And then she writes something that flips the emotional tone completely. I know I should tell him. I know I should be honest. But if I do, everything will fall apart. That sentence reveals the agony of her position. She didn't want to lie. She didn't want to hide. But she believed the truth would destroy everything they were building. Their relationship, their public image, their plans as a family. So she chose silence. And that silence becomes the haunting theme of every entry that follows. Then the next page of the diary, written later that same night, reveals the sentence that kicks this chapter into its next emotional escalation, or says we must begin immediately. There is no more time to hesitate. That line suggests urgency, pressure, a deadline that wasn't flexible, something that had to be carried out quickly, discreetly, and without hesitation. She describes pacing the room at 3 a.m., convincing herself she could handle what was coming. She writes about pressing a pillow against her chest to soothe the ache inside her. She writes about checking her phone for messages from R, even though she'd already received instructions for the next steps. And then she writes a detail that chills you because of how specific and unsettling it is. Tomorrow she will meet me again. She says the screening must be perfect. Screening. That's the first real hint that the plan involved something technical, something medical, something far more complicated than an emotional secret. Meghan doesn't describe the screening, but the word alone is enough to shift this story into a deeper, darker revelation. But the most shocking part of this entry isn't the screening. It isn't the secrecy. It isn't the guilt. It isn't the pressure. It's the way she ends the page. A single, trembling line. If the plan works, no one will ever know I wasn't the one. But the diary never explains what she meant by that. Not yet. What kind of meeting is so dangerous, so emotionally corrosive, so life-altering that the very person who attended it later writes in her diary that she must forget it ever happened? What kind of conversation forces someone to reshape their identity, rewrite their timeline, and lock away a truth so explosive that even her closest relationship can't absorb it? Those are the questions you can't escape as Chapter 2 begins, because Meghan's next diary entry doesn't whisper. No, it erupts. It detonates right from the first line. I shouldn't have gone, but it was too late to turn back. That line is like a door slamming shut on her old life. And as you dive deeper into this entry, you feel a cold clarity. This wasn't a routine appointment. This wasn't a friendly consultation. This was the moment the plan became real. The entry opens with Meghan describing the drive to the meeting in chilling detail. She writes about the color of the sky. Gray and low, like a lid pressed tight over her thoughts. She writes about her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her pulse pounding with each turn she took. She describes how the car's interior felt suffocating, the air stale, as if even the vehicle understood the weight of what she was about to do. She writes about glancing at her reflection in the rearview mirror and failing to recognize the woman staring back. I looked like someone walking into a confession booth, she writes. Except the sin hadn't happened yet. The contradictions start immediately. She claims she chose this path, yet everything in her descriptions screams reluctance. She claims it was necessary, yet every sentence radiates the energy of a person marching toward a destiny she didn't fully want but felt obligated to fulfill. This is where the emotional storm inside her becomes impossible to ignore. The woman the public saw, composed, glowing, hopeful, was nowhere to be found in these diary lines. This was someone haunted, someone pushed by invisible forces, someone desperately rehearsing lies she hadn't even told yet. Then she writes about parking the car and sitting for nearly 10 minutes without moving. She describes staring at the building's entrance, watching people walk in and out, every movement seeming calm compared to the war happening inside her chest. She writes about thinking, just for a moment. About driving away, pretending the meeting didn't exist, calling R and saying she changed her mind. But she also writes that she couldn't. Once you take the first step, she says, the ground behind you disappears. That metaphor freezes you because it implies the plan wasn't just a choice. It was a one-way road. Finally, she describes forcing herself to open the car door, stepping into the cold air, and walking toward the building. She writes about how each step felt heavier than the last, like she was walking through water. She describes pressing the elevator button, the tiny ding that followed, the metallic walls reflecting her nervous expression. She writes that the elevator ride felt endless even though it lasted only a few seconds. Every second stretched, she writes. It felt like time was warning me. Then the elevator doors opened, and she stepped into the meeting. This is where the diary becomes suffocating in its detail. Meghan describes the room as quiet, too quiet. She writes about the sterile smell, the hum of a machine in the corner, the coldness of the floor beneath her feet. She describes how R stood near a table, waiting for her, hands folded calmly, as if she had predicted the exact minute Meghan would arrive. Meghan writes that R's expression didn't change. No smile, no concern, no encouragement. Just calm neutrality. It was like she'd removed her humanity, Meghan writes, as if she had to detach herself from the consequences of what we were about to discuss. And then comes the shock. I wasn't alone. Meghan writes that two other people were in the room. One was a woman with glasses and a clipboard, writing so quickly it felt like she was trying to outrun Meghan's thoughts. The other was a man who barely looked up, flipping through documents as if he'd seen this scenario hundreds of times. Meghan describes feeling like she had walked into a team preparing for a mission centered on her, yet somehow not belonging to her. They were ready, she writes. I wasn't. Then the conversation begins, and the tone shifts sharply into something clinical, calculated, and cold. Meghan writes that her started laying out the plan in steps, each one delivered with the precision of an engineer building a machine. She describes hearing phrases like viability, compatibility, timeline, and confidentiality, each word hitting her like a stone. She says the others asked questions she didn't know how to answer, terms she didn't recognize, decisions she didn't feel equipped to make. And yet, she agreed to everything. When the woman with the clipboard asked if she was certain, Meghan writes that she forced herself to say yes, even though her stomach twisted violently at the word. Then comes the first direct mention of the arrangement's true nature. Meghan writes, they asked if the candidate had been finalized. Candidate. That single word is a dagger. It immediately suggests someone else is involved. Not Harry, not a doctor, not a consultant, but another woman. A woman who plays a pivotal role in the plan. Meghan doesn't record her name, but she writes that her looked her in the eyes and said, she is ready. Meghan describes how her breath caught in her throat when she heard that. Ready. As if this woman, this candidate, had been preparing for something life-changing long before Meghan found the courage to accept what the plan truly meant. Then Meghan writes about emotions flooding her mind in rapid succession. Relief, fear, guilt, panic, hope, shame. She describes wanting to ask 1,000 questions, but feeling like none of them would change the outcome. She describes feeling like she was floating above her body, watching herself nod mechanically as her continued speaking, as the others scribbled notes, as the plan crystallized into something far more solid than she was ready for. And then she writes something that reveals the emotional fracture widening inside her. I kept thinking about Harry. What would he say if he knew the truth? Would he be angry? Hurt? Would he think I betrayed him? These questions torment her. She writes that each time she imagined telling him, her throat closed up and tears burned her eyes. But then she writes something even more heartbreaking. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to share the burden. But I knew if I did, he would try to stop it. That line reveals the real reason behind her silence. She wasn't just afraid of his reaction. She was afraid he would prevent the plan from happening. Then the meeting takes a turn that transforms the emotional tension into something almost unbearable. Meghan writes that the woman with the clipboard handed her a document. A contract. She describes flipping through pages filled with legal terms, obligations, confidentiality clauses, medical conditions, and timelines. She writes that the contract outlined the entire plan in cold, clinical language. She writes that it listed responsibilities, restrictions, and consequences. And she writes that her hands shook as she turned each page, realizing this wasn't an abstract conversation anymore. This was binding. This was real. This was happening. Or then stepped closer and placed a pen in front of her. Meghan writes that her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear. She describes staring at the pen, her vision blurring, her throat tightening. She writes that this was the moment she understood the magnitude of what she was doing. This signature will rewrite everything, or said, according to Meghan's diary. Everything from now on must align with the story. The story, not the truth. The story. Meghan writes that the room spun for a moment. And then, almost on instinct, almost out of desperation to silence the storm inside her, she picked up the pen. She describes gripping it tightly, too tightly, and forcing herself to sign her name. She says her hand trembled so violently she worried the signature would be unreadable. And when she placed the pen back on the table, she writes that she felt something inside her break. I signed away who I used to be, she writes, and I became someone else. She describes silence filling the room after her signature. Heavy silence. Final silence. She writes that everyone seemed to exhale at once, as if they'd been waiting for that exact moment. The woman with the clipboard collected the contract. The man stood and left without a word. I remained still, watching Meghan with an expression Meghan couldn't decipher. Was it sympathy? Satisfaction? Indifference? Meghan writes that she couldn't tell, and she didn't want to know. Then Ar spoke the sentence that changes everything in this chapter. The candidate will begin the process tomorrow. Those words echoed in Meghan's mind. The candidate. The process. Tomorrow. She writes that she felt dizzy, overwhelmed, unstable. She describes sitting down abruptly, afraid she would faint. She writes that Ar placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "It is done. We move forward now." And in that moment, a cold reality settled over Meghan's mind. This wasn't just a plan anymore. This wasn't just a secret. This was her new reality. Then the entry shifts again, this time into a memory from later that afternoon. Meghan writes about walking out of the building and feeling the sun hit her face like a slap. She describes the world looking different, sharper, louder, heavier. She writes about getting into her car, closing the door, and bursting into tears she couldn't control. She writes that she cried until her chest hurt, crying for herself, for Harry, for the version of their future she had just erased. And then she writes something chilling. "I cried because I knew I could never undo what I'd done." She describes driving home with blurry vision, her breath shaking, her fingers gripping the wheel too tightly. She writes about rehearsing what she would say to Harry if he asked where she'd been. She constructs excuses, harmless ones. Errands, meetings, walks, anything that would divert suspicion. And she writes that she hated herself for lying before she even reached the driveway. Then she describes walking into the house and seeing Harry on the couch, smiling at her with the brightness of someone who loves deeply and trusts completely. She writes that his eyes softened, his voice warmed, and she felt like she couldn't breathe. "I almost told him," she writes. "I almost broke down." But she didn't. She forced a smile. She walked into his arms. She pretended she was fine. But the diary ends with one final line that sends shivers down your spine. "Tomorrow Ar will meet the candidate, and the process will begin. And once it starts, there is no turning back." And what Meghan writes in the next chapter, it makes everything far worse. What happens when the image the world believes is flawless begins to fracture, quietly, invisibly, behind the scenes, long before anyone outside the palace notices? What happens when the woman at the center of the fairy tale writes in her own handwriting that the story everyone sees is not the story she is living? That is exactly where Chapter 3 begins, because the next diary entry isn't calm, reflective, or controlled. It is frantic, unstable, emotional. It opens with a line that immediately changes the tone of everything that came before. "I can't keep pretending the fairy tale is real." The fairy tale, the one the world was sold. The one the cameras captured. The one crafted through smiles, polished appearances, glowing headlines, and carefully timed announcements. Meghan writes as though she's standing in two realities, the one projected to millions and the one documented in the pages of her diary. The contrast between them is brutal. She describes waking up the morning after the meeting like someone waking from a nightmare. Except the nightmare wasn't over, it was only beginning. She writes that she lay still for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, feeling like she was underwater. "My chest hurt," she writes. "My head was heavy, and every sound felt distant." She calls it a quiet panic, the kind that sits in your throat and refuses to move. Then she writes about Harry waking beside her, brushing her shoulder gently, completely unaware of the storm building inches away from him. She writes about forcing a smile, touching his cheek, pretending she'd slept fine. And while Harry talked about future plans and public anticipation, her diary shows her mind was trapped in the meeting room, replaying every word Ar had said, every document she had signed, every commitment she had just sealed. This is where the contradictions begin, painting a picture that's impossible to ignore. The diary describes Meghan's internal collapse, while the world saw only a composed public figure. The diary describes guilt, while the world saw hope. The diary describes secrecy, while the world saw unity. And then she writes the sentence that is the emotional core of this entire entry. "I didn't feel pregnant. I felt pressured." That line is devastating, not because of what it implies physically, but because of what it reveals emotionally. She writes that she felt detached from herself, as though someone else had taken over her decisions. She describes preparing herself mentally to step into the public role expected of her. A glowing royal mother-to-be, while her private reality spun further and further from that image. She writes that she looked in the mirror that morning and whispered, "I'm supposed to look happy," practicing the expression the world would soon expect from her. Then she reveals the moment the first real crack in the fairy tale appeared. She writes that during breakfast, Harry excitedly talked about sharing their news with the family, about timing, about formalities. He was animated, hopeful, innocent, and Meghan writes that the more he talked, the more she felt her pulse spike in panic. She describes feeling faint, so faint she had to grip the table's edge. She describes pushing food around her plate, but barely eating. She writes that she excused herself to the bathroom, locked the door, and burst into silent tears because she couldn't handle the contrast between Harry's joy and the truth she was withholding. She writes, "He deserves to know. But if I tell him, everything stops." That is the heart of her torment. Then the diary jumps to later that afternoon. Meghan describes a palace meeting, a casual one, not official or serious. But every conversation during that meeting deepened her guilt. She writes about hearing staff mention the press interest, the speculation, the excitement building online. She describes feeling exposed even though no one knew anything yet. "It felt like everyone was celebrating a story that wasn't real," she writes. "I felt like an actress trapped in a script I didn't write." Then she confesses something even more haunting. "Every time someone said baby, I felt like a fraud. Not because she didn't want children, not because she doubted the plan, but because the truth behind their future children wasn't what anyone believed. Not Harry, not the palace, not the public, not the world." Then the diary shifts into a memory that reveals the first sign Harry sensed something was wrong. Meghan writes that he came into the room later that day and found her staring out the window, lost in thought. He touched her shoulder gently, asked if everything was okay, and she said yes, too quickly, too sharply. She writes that he didn't push, but she saw the concern in his eyes. "He looked at me differently," she writes, as if he sensed something beneath the surface. And then she writes the line that is the turning point in this chapter. "That's when I realized the fairy tale wasn't just breaking for me, it was breaking for us." This leads into one of the most emotional sequences in the diary. Meghan describes lying awake that night beside Harry, listening to him breathe, and feeling her own heartbeat hammering against her ribcage. She writes that she turned onto her side, staring at the wall, tears pooling in her eyes because she knew she was pushing him away without meaning to. She writes that Harry reached for her in his sleep, instinctively, protectively, but she curled away, not because she didn't want him, but because the guilt was too heavy to bear. "Every time he touched me, I felt like I was stealing something from him," she writes. Then the diary jumps abruptly into a revelation that almost seems out of place, until you realize it isn't. Meghan writes that the timeline she was supposed to follow publicly didn't match the timeline the plan demanded privately. And here comes the painful contradiction. She writes that she was expected to appear physically and emotionally in sync with the public narrative, even though her reality was moving on a different schedule. She writes about pressure to keep track of dates, to avoid contradictions in conversations, to align her story perfectly with the palace's expected timeline. She writes about rehearsing answers in my head, afraid of slipping, afraid of confusing the crafted narrative with the real one. Then she writes about R again. This time, the mention of R is sharper, colder, more serious. Meghan writes that she received another message. "Everything is progressing. We need your confirmation on the next step." Meghan writes that she stared at the message for a long time, feeling like the walls around her were closing in. She describes walking outside into the garden, trying to breathe, trying to clear her mind, trying to feel normal. But she couldn't. She writes that every bird, every breeze, every moment of quiet felt like it was mocking her. And then she writes the moment the fairy tale cracked wide open. She describes getting a second message. Not from R, but from an unknown number. A message that said only, "We are ready when you are." Meghan writes that her stomach dropped so fast she felt dizzy. She writes that she deleted the message immediately, terrified Harry would see it. She describes pacing the room, trying to calm herself, but failing. She writes that she felt like she was falling down a staircase with no end. Then she reveals something emotionally explosive. She writes that she almost told Harry the truth that night. She says she walked toward him while he was sitting on the couch, reading. She says she opened her mouth, ready to speak. But when he looked up at her with those soft eyes, those trusting eyes, she froze. I couldn't break him, she writes. Not like that. Not then. Instead, she walked away, silently. And Harry, confused, followed her with his eyes. This sets up the final part of the chapter, the part where Meghan admits something that changes the emotional tone from guilt to dread. She writes, "The plan is moving faster than I expected, and the cracks are showing." She lists those cracks. Her mood swings, the slipping timeline, Harry's growing suspicion, her inability to maintain the public facade, the pressure from R, the messages from unknown numbers, the emotional disconnect between her and the narrative. She describes every crack widening until she writes the final line of the chapter. "I'm terrified the truth will come out before the plan is complete. And if that happens, everything, our marriage, our image, our family, will collapse. Everything." But the next diary entry doesn't just continue the cracks. It shatters the entire foundation. What happens when the timeline you're supposed to live doesn't match the timeline you're actually in? What happens when days blur into one another not because you're overwhelmed, but because you're trying to line them up with a story that isn't real? That is the central horror of Chapter 4, because Meghan's next diary entry doesn't begin with emotion or confession. It begins with calculation. Cold, precise, panic calculation. The very first sentence reveals everything about her state of mind. "The dates aren't aligning, and I don't know how long I can keep pretending they do." That one line destroys the illusion the public believed and exposes the private chaos she was drowning in. Meghan writes as though she has entered a labyrinth made entirely of timestamps, deadlines, announcements, and expectations. She describes waking up that morning with a sensation that something was wrong, not emotionally, but logistically. She writes that she grabbed her notebook, her planner, her phone, and the palace schedule, dumping them all onto the bed in a frantic attempt to reconcile the reality she was living with the narrative she was expected to follow. And she couldn't. "The dates were rebelling," she writes. "They refused to line up no matter how many times I rewrote them." She describes scratching out numbers, rewriting them, circling them, highlighting them, threatening them with her pen as if intimidation could force them into agreement. She writes that she wasn't just trying to match days. She was trying to match symptoms, timelines, expectations. She describes trying to figure out what she was supposed to feel publicly versus what the plan required privately. And every time she thought she had found a solution, something else didn't make sense. A doctor appointment that shouldn't have existed yet. A public appearance she shouldn't have been able to attend. A statement she was expected to make at a time that didn't match her physical reality. And then comes the first emotional break of the chapter. "I felt like I was living inside a lie built with mismatched puzzle pieces." That line is devastating because it reveals not just secrecy, but fragmentation. Meghan wasn't living one lie. She was living in 10 small ones that needed to connect seamlessly, and they weren't connecting. Then she describes the moment she realized the timeline issue wasn't just a minor problem. It was a ticking time bomb. She writes about a conversation with palace staff, innocent and casual, where someone asked her a simple question about dates. Not a probing question, not a suspicious question, just a routine one. And Meghan froze. She writes that her mind went blank, her throat tightened, and she stumbled through an answer that didn't feel convincing even to herself. She writes about seeing the staff members' eyebrows knit together, not in suspicion, but in mild confusion. But that was enough. Even mild confusion felt like an accusation, she writes. This is where the diary becomes suffocating. Meghan writes that she excused herself and rushed upstairs, locking the door behind her. She describes sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, breathing rapidly, her chest tightening. She writes that she kept repeating the timeline in her head like a mantra, trying to memorize the numbers, trying to internalize the story so deeply that she could recite it without hesitation. But it didn't work. The dates didn't stick. The contradictions multiplied. Then she writes the line that sets the entire chapter on fire. The plan's timeline and the palace's timeline are drifting apart. drifting apart, like two trains on parallel tracks slowly separating until the distance becomes impossible to bridge. Meghan writes that this realization made her feel like she was losing control. She describes pacing the room, running her fingers through her hair, muttering dates aloud, looking in the mirror and telling herself to hold it together. She writes that she splashed cold water on her face, tried breathing exercises, tried forcing calm into her body, but the panic kept rising. It felt like time was working against me, she writes, like it was planning my downfall. Then she writes about Harry. And here, the emotional tension spikes. Meghan describes him knocking on the door, his voice gentle, asking if she was okay. She writes that she wanted to scream, no, but instead forced her voice to say, I'm fine. But she writes that she didn't open the door. She couldn't. Not with the panic twisting her insides. Not with the fear that he would see the chaos in her eyes. She writes that she heard the concern in his voice when he said, Are you sure? And she writes that she hated herself for lying, hated herself for pushing him away, hated the secret that stood between them like a wall made of glass, transparent, fragile, dangerous. Then comes a shift, a quiet, chilling one. Meghan writes that after she finally calmed herself enough to leave the room, she walked into the hallway and saw Harry standing at the other end, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not suspicion, not anger, something worse. Worry. Deep, genuine worry. Meghan writes that his eyes followed her every step, searching for answers she couldn't give. She writes that his silence that day was louder than any confrontation. He felt me slipping away, she writes. I could see it in the way he stood. Then the diary shifts again, describing a palace engagement scheduled for later that week. Meghan writes that everything about the event felt wrong. She writes that she had to stand, walk, smile, wave, perform normalcy. While knowing the timeline behind the scenes wasn't aligning, she writes that every camera flash felt like an interrogation, every journalist's glance felt like a spotlight, every member of the public who reached out to touch her hand felt like a reminder that she was living a lie. She describes smiling for photos while her stomach twisted with dread. She writes about standing beside Harry as he beamed, while she felt like she was fading. She writes that she kept touching her stomach in public. Not out of instinct, but because she knew it was expected of her. She writes that the gesture felt empty, hollow, like mimicking a role she didn't belong to. I felt disconnected from my own body, she writes. And then she reveals a moment that serves as the emotional breaking point of the chapter. She writes that during the event, an older woman in the crowd reached out, touched Meghan's arm, and said softly, You're glowing, dear. Meghan writes that she felt her throat close up and her eyes sting with tears because she didn't feel glowing. She didn't feel beautiful. She didn't feel expectant. She felt like a fraud wrapped in fabric. She writes that she forced a laugh and thanked the woman, but the compliment haunted her the rest of the day. Then she writes about returning home and collapsing onto the bed, exhausted not from the event, but from maintaining the facade. She writes that Harry sat beside her, brushing her hair gently away from her forehead and asking again if she was all right. She writes that she nodded, eyes closed, unable to form words. And then she writes something that makes the guilt almost unbearable. I could feel him trying. I could feel him reaching for me. And I couldn't reach back. The timeline wasn't just breaking. Their relationship was. Then Meghan writes about R again, and this time the mention is sharp, urgent, alarming. Meghan says R contacted her with an update. We need to accelerate. Accelerate what? Meghan doesn't clarify, but she describes feeling her blood run cold. She writes that accelerating the plan would make the timeline even harder to hide, harder to maintain, harder to reconcile with the palace narrative. She writes that she responded to R with, Are you sure? And R simply answered, We have no choice. This is where the diary shifts into true dread. Meghan writes that accelerating the plan meant accelerating the lie. Accelerating the lie meant accelerating the risk. And accelerating the risk meant accelerating the emotional collapse she was already battling. She writes that she paced the room for over an hour, debating whether to push back, whether to insist on slowing down, whether to demand more time. But she didn't, and she writes the chilling reason why. I'm in too deep. Then comes the moment that ruptures the entire emotional arc of the chapter. Who was the woman referred to only as RL in Meghan's diary? Who is the figure so central to the plan that Meghan avoids even writing her full name? As though ink itself could expose a truth she wasn't ready to face. That's where Chapter 5 begins, because Meghan's next diary entry does not start with guilt or panic or timelines. It begins with a name that isn't fully a name. A ghost. A shadow. A set of initials that carry more weight than any full identity could. RL. Visited today, Meghan writes in a line that feels like the first hinge in a massive door swinging open. And I wasn't prepared for what she told me. The entry unfolds like a confession wrapped in dread. Meghan writes that she hadn't slept the night before. Not a minute. She lay awake replaying her timelines, rehearsing her lies, whispering excuses into the dark, terrified she would mix up details when the palace's questions inevitably came. And just when she felt like exhaustion might finally force her eyes to close, her phone buzzed. A message from R. Not a greeting. Not reassurance. Just 2 words. She's coming. She. The woman behind the initials. The woman whose involvement made the plan possible. The woman whose existence Meghan wanted to erase even from her diary. Meghan describes her stomach dropping when she read the message. She writes that she sat up in bed, heart pounding, hands trembling, because she knew what this meant. Today wasn't just another day in the internal storm. Today was the day she had to meet the reality of the plan face to face. She writes that she felt cold, even though the room was warm. She describes walking to the mirror and seeing dark circles under her eyes, a pale face, a version of herself she barely recognized. I looked like someone who was about to meet a future that wasn't hers, she writes. That sentence is heartbreaking, heavy, and honest. Then she writes about walking downstairs to the kitchen. Harry was already awake, humming, making breakfast, unaware that today would push Meghan deeper into the secret than she'd ever been before. Meghan writes that he smiled at her, touched her waist, asked if she wanted tea. She forced a smile and said yes, but she writes that her heart